Have you ever heard of a revolution sparked not by soldiers, but by market women? Not with guns and cannons, but with pots, pans, and an unbreakable will. This is the story of the Lioness of Nigeria, a woman who taught an empire a lesson it would never forget. Our story begins in the 1940s, in the ancient city of Abeokuta, Nigeria. Under the shadow of British colonial rule, life was hard, but for the women who formed the city's economic backbone, it was becoming impossible. The local ruler, the Alek, backed by the British, was imposing crushing taxes on everything. Imagine having to pay a tax just to have a child, or for the very scales you use to weigh food for your family. The market women were harassed, fined, and even beaten if they couldn't pay. Their dignity was stripped away, their livelihoods threatened. The system was designed to break them, but in this city, a quiet force was gathering. A school teacher, one of the few women of her time to receive a formal education abroad, saw this injustice and refused to look away. Her name was Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti. She had returned from England with a new perspective, and she saw the suffering of her sisters with clear eyes. She knew that education wasn't just for the classroom. It was a tool, a weapon for liberation. She started small, teaching the market women how to read and write. But these literacy classes quickly transformed into something much bigger. Consciousness-raising sessions. The women began to share their stories of hardship, their anger, and their frustration. In these shared experiences, a powerful bond was forged. They were no longer just individual victims. They were a collective, a unified force. Funmilayo helped them understand the colonial system, how the taxes were being used not to help them, but to enrich the rulers. The spark of rebellion was lit. In 1946, Funmilayo officially founded the Abeokuta Women's Union. This wasn't just a social club. It was an army in the making, an army of thousands of women from all walks of life, united by a common cause. Their demand was simple but revolutionary. Abolish the unjust taxes and remove the corrupt Alek from his throne. They wrote petitions and letters, using the power of the written word Funmilayo had taught them. But the authorities ignored them. They dismissed them as just a group of noisy, uneducated women. They had no idea who they were dealing with. When their words were ignored, Funmilayo decided it was time for action. She organized one of the most incredible protests in Nigerian history. We're not talking about a few hundred people. We're talking about 10,000 women, dressed in their finest traditional attire, descending upon the Alek's palace. 4 days, they occupied the palace grounds. They sang protest songs that mocked the Alek and the British officials. They chanted, they danced, and they refused to move. The authorities were stunned. They had never seen anything like it. This wasn't a riot. It was a disciplined, organized, and relentless demonstration of people power. They tried to intimidate the women, but Funmilayo stood at the forefront, her courage inspiring everyone. She told the women, "We are no longer your property. We are the mothers of this nation, and we will not be silenced." Tea protests, which became known as the Abeokuta Women's Revolt or the Egba Women's Tax Riot, paralyzed the city and captured the attention of the entire country, and even the world. The colonial government couldn't ignore 10,000 defiant women camped on their doorstep. The pressure became immense. The Alek, the once untouchable ruler, was completely humiliated. His authority crumbled under the weight of the women's collective voice. After nearly 2 years of relentless protest, the women won. In 1949, the impossible happened. The crippling taxes on women were abolished, and the Alek was forced to abdicate his throne and go into exile. It was a stunning victory. A group of market women, led by a school teacher, had faced down the British Empire and won. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti became a national hero, a symbol of resistance and female power. But her fight didn't end there. She became a leading figure in the anti-colonial movement, fighting for Nigeria's independence. She fought for women's right to vote, a right they won thanks to her tireless campaigning. She traveled the world, meeting other freedom fighters and sharing her story, advocating for the rights of women and the oppressed everywhere. She co-founded political parties and stood for election at a time when the idea of a woman in politics was almost unthinkable. Her activism, however, came at a great personal cost. She was constantly monitored, harassed, and even jailed by both the colonial and later post-independence Nigerian governments who saw her as a threat. They called her a communist, a troublemaker, anything to discredit her. But they could never break her spirit. She was a mother not only to her own famous Chudranfela Biko and Olikoi, who would all become prominent figures themselves, but to a whole nation. She raised a generation of activists and inspired millions. Her life came to a tragic end in 1978 after a brutal military raid on her Sunfella compound. But the legacy of Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, the Lioness of Nigeria, could not be erased. She proved that one person, armed with courage and a belief in justice, can ignite a movement that changes the world. She showed that true power doesn't come from a throne or a gun, but from the unity and determination of the people. Her story reminds us that the fight for freedom and equality is a long one, but it's a fight that can be won. Wait, before we dive into the fight, let's rewind to the beginning. Because this warrior was first a scholar, born Frances Abigail Ali Funmilayo Thomas in 1900. She broke barriers. She was the first female student ever admitted to the Abeokuta Grammar School. After that, she studied abroad in England, a rare and radical move for a Nigerian woman of her time. When she returned, she didn't come back to be a docile wife. She came back as a force of nature ready to reshape the world around her. She soon married Reverend Israel Alidotan Ransome-Kuti, and together they would raise some of Nigeria's most famous revolutionaries, Fela Kuti. Funmilayo's focus was immediately on the women of Abeokuta. She started modestly the Abeokuta Ladies' Club, a place where women could learn domestic skills and share their lives. But the stories she heard there were not about cooking and sewing. They were tales of hardship, economic exploitation, and brutal, unfair taxation imposed by the British colonial administration through the puppet ruler, the Kavegba. Hearing these struggles, Funmilayo transformed her little club into a political juggernaut. The Abeokuta Women's Union, the membership exploded, surging from just 80 educated women to over 20,000 market women, farmers, and traders. She educated them on their fundamental rights, organized them by trade, and taught them the sheer, unstoppable power of collective bargaining. Funmilayo's revolution was genius in its simplicity and discipline. Their primary weapon, total, unwavering non-cooperation. They sang mocking, rhythmic songs outside the colonial offices and the palace, using their traditional status to expose and ridicule the corrupt authorities. The atmosphere was electric. This wasn't a riot. It was an organized social revolt. The climax came in 1949, a moment that became known as the Egbo Women's Tax Revolt. Tens of thousands of women, impeccably organized and dressed uniformly in local surrounded the Elegas Palace. They used a powerful, shuffling protest dance, known as literally blocking all access to the palace, trapping the king inside. The women stood firm for days. They slept rough. They cooked in the streets. They endured threats and intimidation, but they never wavered. The pressure was immense, unstoppable. The message was clear. The women owned this town now, and they won. The hated taxes were immediately abolished, and the ultimate victory. Yalak was forced to abdicate and flee into exile. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti had done the impossible. She had taken 20,000 organized market women and farmers, armed them only with unity and songs, and toppled a king. But her fight was just beginning. Funmilayo immediately took her battle national. She co-founded the Nigerian Women's Union, dedicating herself to fighting for women's suffrage, the right to vote, demanding a real, powerful voice for women in an independent Nigeria. She was so effective, so respected, and so feared by the British that she became the only woman to be included on the nationalist delegation to London to discuss Nigeria's path to independence. She wasn't just watching history unfold. She was crafting it, one protest, one victory at a time. She was also famously the first woman in Abeokuta to drive a car, a powerful symbolic act of independence and mobility. Funmilayo's political footprint expanded rapidly. She wasn't just interested in Nigeria. She was a global Pan-Africanist. She traveled the world, meeting other revolutionary figures like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and even Chairman Mao in China, meeting that led the paranoid U.S. government to deny her a travel visa, labeling her a communist threat. She was fearless, outspoken, and utterly uncompromising in her demand for equality. After Nigeria gained independence in 1960, she continued to fight the corruption that plagued the new government. She was constantly battling political inertia and entrenched male power structures, demanding proper representation for women in all levels of government. Now, her later life was dominated by her family's activism and the brutal reaction it provoked from the Nigerian military regime of the 1970s. This is where the story turns truly tragic, but also cements her legacy as the courageous, defiant mother of the nation. Her son, Fela Kuti, was an internationally famous musician and activist whose compound, the Calcutta Republic, was a haven for dissidents and a constant thorn in the side of the military government. In 1977, the military decided to silence Fela permanently. Over 1,000 armed soldiers stormed the Calcutta Republic in one of the most vicious assaults on a civilian residence in Nigerian history. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti was there. Even at the age of 77, she stood up to the invading soldiers. In the chaos, she was brutally attacked and thrown from a second-story window. She never fully recovered from that horrific injury. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, the Lioness of Nigeria, died in April 1978 from complications related to that assault. Her death, caused by the very government she fought against, became a galvanizing force. Fela famously responded by releasing the album Unknown Soldier, delivering a symbolic coffin to the military barracks in protest of his mother's murder. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti's impact is incalculable. She paved the way for generations of female leaders, proving that women's organization is the most potent political weapon available. She wasn't just a pioneer. She was an architect of modern Nigerian protest, a radical educator, and a political powerhouse. She is remembered not just as Fela's mother, but as the true mother of the nation. What do you think was Funmilayo's boldest move? Was it driving the car, toppling the king, or standing up to the soldiers in 1977? It gave birth to a dynasty of defiance. To understand Funmilayo, you must first understand the world she was born into in 1900. A British colony where women were seen, but rarely heard, where their roles were confined to the home and the market, their voices silenced by colonial decrees and patriarchal traditions. Funmilayo was meant to be a teacher, a respectable, quiet profession. But quiet was never in her vocabulary. Her journey began not with a roar, but with a question. As a young teacher and wife, she noticed the women around her, the market women of Abeokuta, groaning under the weight of unfair taxes imposed by the colonial-backed local ruler, the Alak. These taxes weren't just a financial burden. They were a symbol of their powerlessness. While men were taxed based on their income, women were taxed per head, regardless of their earnings. It was an injustice that sparked a fire in Funmilayo. She started small, forming the Abeokuta Ladies Club. At first, it was about literacy and etiquette, but Funmilayo quickly transformed it into something far more radical. The Abeokuta Women's Union, an army of tens of thousands of women, many of whom couldn't read or write but understood the universal language of oppression. Funmilayo became their voice, their strategist, their general. They called her Biare Yoruba, title of respect for a powerful female leader. She taught them to organize, to protest, to use their collective power as a weapon. Imagine the scene. Thousands of women, dressed in their traditional attire, marching to the king's palace. They weren't just marching, they were singing, chanting, and demanding their rights. They staged sit-ins that lasted for days, shutting down the city. They were fearless. They followed Funmilayo's lead, facing down armed police and colonial officials. Their demands were simple: abolish the unfair tax, and remove the puppet king. The Alake, the establishment laughed. How could a group of illiterate market women possibly challenge the might of the British Empire and its local collaborators? They underestimated the Lioness of Nigeria. After a relentless, 2-year campaign of civil disobedience, the unthinkable happened. In 1949, the Alake abdicated his throne, and the hated tax was abolished. Funmilayo and her women had won. They had brought a king to his knees. This victory sent shockwaves across Nigeria and beyond. It was a testament to the power of grassroots organizing, led by a woman who refused to accept the status quo. But Funmilayo was just getting started. She became a national figure, a powerful voice in the struggle for Nigeria's independence. She was the only woman in the delegation sent to London to negotiate Nigeria's freedom. She traveled the world, meeting with leaders like Mao Zedong in China, earning her the ire of the British and American governments, who saw her as a dangerous radical. They were right to be afraid. She was dangerous to the systems of oppression they represented. She championed women's suffrage, demanding the right to vote for every Nigerian woman. A battle she eventually won. She was a pioneer in every sense of the word, breaking barriers with a force that seemed unstoppable. She was the first Nigerian woman to drive a car, a small act of defiance that symbolized a much larger journey towards liberation. Her greatest legacy, perhaps, was the fire she lit in her own home. She raised her sons, not just to be successful, but to be fearless challengers of injustice. Look at the fruits of her spirit. Her son, Professor Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, became a world-renowned pediatrician and Nigeria's health minister, a man who fought for public health with the same tenacity his mother fought for political rights. Another son, Dr. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti, became a celebrated doctor and a tireless human rights activist, who, like his mother, would suffer imprisonment for his convictions. And then there was Fela. Her spirit lived on most famously in her son, Fela Anikulapo-Kuti, the creator of Afrobeat. He took his mother's political fire and set it to music. His songs weren't just music, they were weapons, anthems of resistance, like Zambi, and Coffin for Head of State became the soundtrack of a generation fighting against Nigeria's corrupt and brutal military regimes. His home, the Kalikuta Republic, became a commune, a recording studio, and an epicenter of dissent, a continuation of the revolutionary space his mother had carved out decades earlier. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and the regime Fela challenged was the descendant of the colonial powers his mother had fought, and they struck back with the same brutal cowardice. On a dark day in 1978, 1,000 soldiers stormed the Kalikuta Republic. In the chaos and violence, they found the matriarch, T-70-year-old Funmilayo, the lioness, in an act of unimaginable cruelty. These soldiers threw her from a second-story window. She never fully recovered from her injuries. The woman who had faced down an empire, who had deposed a king, who had inspired millions, died a year later from the wounds inflicted by the very forces she had spent her life fighting. She was a martyr for freedom. Her funeral was one of the largest in Nigerian history, a testament to the nation she had helped build. But you cannot kill a spirit. You cannot bury a legacy that has taken root in the very soul of a nation. Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti's story is not a tragedy. It is a call to action. Her DNA is in every fight for justice in Nigeria today. You can see it in the pro-democracy movements that toppled military rule. You can see it in the market women who still organize for their economic rights. You see it in the fierce, brilliant young women leading the charge for a new Nigeria, like her own granddaughter, who continues the family's legacy of activism. She was the first Nigerian woman to be featured on a postage stamp, a national honor. But a true monument isn't made of paper or stone. It's built from courage. It's found in the heart of every Nigerian who stands up, who speaks out, and who echoes her defiant spirit by saying, "No more." Her life is a powerful reminder that one person, armed with conviction and courage, can indeed start a revolution. She was a teacher, an activist, a mother, and a lioness, and her roar still echoes. Thank you for watching. If you were inspired by this story, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it so that the legacy of Funmilayo Ransome-Kuti continues to inspire generations to come.